It was pitch dark, but there was a yellow glow which seemed to reach the sky. Balls of fire were falling all around us. The jack pine trees had become ignited and were like big torches. By the time we reached the lake, the heat was terrific. Mother had managed to grab a blanket and a horsehide robe from the tent. These Father threw in the water and covered 3 of us with a blanket. Firebrands were falling all around us. Some fell on our blanket, and we had to keep it dipped in the water constantly to prevent it from burning over us. We were all badly burned, especially my father. The horsehide, which he had thrown over my mother and little sister, had burned to a crisp on Mother's back. And then it goes on to say that Teresa's father died the next day of burns sustained while keeping the blankets wet.
Yeah, I can't even imagine that situation. Hey guys, what's happening? Welcome to Your Forest. I'm Matthew Christoph. On this podcast, we talk about environmental sciences. Today's episode, we're talking history. So, 100 years ago, this May, the Great Fire, 1919, giant fire, burnt from Alberta all the way into Saskatchewan. Took out a bunch of communities, a lot of resources. It was pretty much unknown. Most of Canada didn't know about it. There wasn't a whole lot of information out there. It went largely unnoticed besides a couple local papers. It was big news for 10 days while it was burning, and then that was pretty much it. So I brought on Peter Murphy. Peter Murphy's been on in the past. He's awesome. He's, by all accounts, like I said last time he was on episode 62, he is one of the fathers of modern forestry. He's done it all. He's been in forestry since the 50s, so he knows some stuff. And Peter and a couple of his colleagues, Cordy Timstra and Merle Macy, they did a bunch of research, 3.5, almost 4 decades, researching a story about the Great Fire of 1919. This is a story about one of the biggest fire events in Canadian history, one of the most devastating. And they came out with the details and like how many people died, how many communities were taken down by it, what was the economic impact. And I brought him on just to talk about this fire and all the impacts it had on our everyday life and the way we see forest fires today. It's really cool. I mean, this fire happened right after World War I, right after the Spanish flu, all kinds of crazy stuff. So the first little bit, we talk about kind of the setting of when this all happened, and then we get into the impact of it and why this is so wild, how big this fire is. We talk about the specifics about how big it is. It's really, really cool. So I hope you guys like it. The story is brought to you by West Fraser. Their funds are made available through the Forest Resource Improvement Association of Alberta. Thank you very much for your support. I could not do this without you guys. And secondary sponsors are Greenlink Forestry and Damage Timber. Damage Timber is an apparel company out of Edmonton, Alberta. They support environmental sciences through the sale of their clothing. 10% of all they get goes towards a scholarship for environmental sciences students. So make sure to check them out. Go to damagetimber.com and you can help up just by wearing clothes. So thanks a lot, guys. And without any further messing around, let's get into it. Peter and I, here we go. So I was thinking that a good way to start, like I was saying, would be to just describe the era that we're talking about. So 1919, like, what is life like? What is going on, in the world stage historically? Like, just paint a picture for people that might not know what exactly the era is we're describing.
That's a good question, and it helps to provide the setting. Yeah, so 1919 was quite an eventful year. The Great War had just ended, and the veterans were returning, and many of them were looking for places to settle and to homestead, that they had much money, but homesteading was still a possibility. In 1919, a lot of the best land, prairie land, had been already settled, so settlement was beginning to get into the grey wooded soils covered with forests, which turned out to be good farmland as well. So there was a movement into the forest, and to prove up on homesteads, it was required that you clear a certain amount, and so cutting and burning was the method that was used. And it was also a time of turmoil. The noted Winnipeg strike of 1919 took on when rioters overturned a streetcar and protesting.
I don't think I've known about that.
Yeah, so it was difficult economic times.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a story in itself.
And so we're talking about an era where I don't remember how many people or how many men were overseas fighting the war, but a lot of them were just returning. I'm guessing most people don't have cars, right? So a lot of people are still going kind of horse transportation.
Yeah, team and wagon was the pickup truck
right.
of the day.
Yeah. So
and as well in 1919 was the tail end of the flu epidemic.
Oh, Spanish
flu. As well, yes.
Right.
So there's memories of that, and it had an impact on communities.
So the Spanish flu, was it in Canada at all, or were we just talking about it?
No, it was brought back.
It was.
By returning vets.
Oh. And that was a hell of a flu. Like that killed, like a third of the... I can't remember how much, but it was a giant amount of people that died in like the world population.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Died, and certainly it was debilitating for a lot of other people as well.
Right. So the Great War just finished. The Great Flu just finished.
Yes. There was economic turmoil. It was a state of primitive transportation. Mm-hmm. No highways, certainly. Team and wagon, and travel on the road allowances, which was variable depending on how many sloughs there were in the way.
Well, and a road was just a dirt path more than
that's right.
Right. It's not something that someone laid out, just something that's been worn out over time.
Yeah. So there was not much access and not much mobility, or fast mobility anyhow. And to top it all off, in Saskatchewan, there was an epidemic of grasshoppers in the southern part of the province. So poor old Saskatchewan was really feeling the pinch there during in 1919.
No kidding.
Yeah.
Jeez. Yeah, that's wild. I'm just imagining trying to, you're coming back from the war, you have a family, say, and you're heading out from wherever you're from. Let's say you're in Edmonton, and you're going to go homestead out by Lac La Biche, right, which is where some of these fires started. Yes. And you jump in the horse and wagon, and you head out that way, and you got to start clearing land and burning land for your farm. How long does it take? Like, it's going to take you years and years. You're not talking about chainsaws and machinery, right? You're talking about an axe or a saw.
Yes.
And that's about it.
To get the trees down, and then it's a major effort to get the stumps out.
Oh, right. Yeah, you got to pull the stumps out. Yeah. Right. So you're talking, what, like 4 trees a day or something?
Yeah. So there's a lot of piling and burning going on.
Mm-hmm.
So that was part of the background to this fire, that there were settlers all over the country who were trying to clear land. And
I can't imagine that work, right? Like, that's got to be no messing around, right? Like, it's got to take years to clear off a section of land that's worth farming, right?
Yeah.
I mean, yeah. So, like, how do you think people were making like ends meet when they're just clearing land? How do you pay for food when you don't? You know what I mean? You're not selling anything. I guess you sell firewood, maybe, or
I think most a lot of the off-farm income was using those same skills that the settlers used in clearing land, and they went logging.
Oh.
So the opportunity to do logging for the sawmills, and there were so many sawmills around, it was typical to
makes sense.
Go logging and get cash income.
Of course. Use the resource that you're cutting down, right? Why not put it to use? Perfect. Yeah, it's a fascinating time. It's just setting out on your own or with your family and trying to pave your own way, right? By just literally clearing out forest and hoping that the soil's good. And I can't imagine the stress of, and after all of those, after the war and after the flu, and now you got grasshoppers and everything. So it's a it's a tight time, I'm guessing, right? Like everything's dirty. I'm guessing you're not bathing all the time, and it's not.
I hadn't thought of that. But
yeah. So
yes.
I just wanted to paint that picture.
So administratively, too, this was before 1930. So the forests, the natural resources, were still a responsibility of the federal government.
Okay.
And it was the Dominion Forestry Branch that was in charge of forestry in Alberta and Saskatchewan. Mm. And their resources were spread pretty thinly as well. A few fire rangers that their main job was to get people to be careful setting fires or prevent fires from starting.
Yeah.
But there was no really organized forest protection or initial attack capability.
Right.
Most of that was community efforts.
Right, of course. So how many fire rangers was there in Alberta at the time, like at the time of this fire? Do you know?
I don't know.
I think I
don't know. The thing is that the fire rangers were seasonal positions, so they were hired in March usually or April, and they were let go in September or whenever things cool down a little bit.
The reason I ask is because there's got to be forest fires happening, right? Forest fires are a part of the natural ecosystem, so they got to be happening all the time. And it seems like I imagine that this Great Fire, was probably the first time a lot of people had encountered wildfire. So it's got to be. I mean, obviously, people in the forestry branch know wildfire, and like rangers will know wildfire, but most of the public is probably not all that savvy to its existence, right?
No, I think that's a fair assessment. And a lot of the settlers came from prairie conditions and were not that accustomed to the forest or forest fires, although they were aware of them and could recognize where fires had been.
I'm sure they know what a burning forest is, but it's
In fact, one of the aftermaths of the fire was settlers coming in were delighted to find that the land had already been cleared.
Oh, perfect.
So their priorities were different than
no kidding.
Forestry people.
Yeah, no kidding. Yeah, I'm sure. So so the forest there was really no forest firefighting back then. It was
very little.
There was a little bit of those rangers. They were just riding around on horseback, or what are we talking about? How are they? Are they just looking for fire, just making sure that
their main job was prevention, trying to get the message out that fires could get away and to take precautions if they were burning. I think it was recognized that settlers had to burn the brush piles.
Right, of course, yeah.
Yeah, but it should do it with due precautions.
So the fire rangers were just going around these people who are homesteaders areas and just keeping tabs on all the burns that they're lighting. So they're not out in the middle of the bush kind of ripping around on horseback looking for fire. They're concentrated to the areas where people are.
Yes.
Okay, I see. Gotcha. That makes sense. So you've got an influx of all these people cutting and burning and trying to create good agricultural land for crops and that. And you've got maybe a couple of rangers. What's the force? So if a ranger spots a fire that gets out of hand, what do they have as resources to fight said fire?
Virtually none.
Okay,
So they would try to organize firefighting efforts at the time. Mm-hmm. But in this particular instance, any organization was just overwhelmed by what followed. It was that's no thought of fighting them. Yeah. So,
do you want to mention the climatic situation going into this fire? You kind of painted a picture of life as, it's a rough and tumble life. It's a gritty. We don't have a lot of resources for firefighting, although we have rangers keeping an eye on it, and not a lot of resources to actually put out a fire. But I'm guessing, going into this, reading through your article that you wrote, it was already a climatic, it was a powder keg. It was ready to go up.
So for the homesteaders, the winter was tough. They're always tough. And so in early March, when spring arrived early and the sun came out, there was great celebration because it was warm and easy to get around.
Right.
But then that deteriorated as far as the fire situation is concerned. It stayed hot and dry,
Mm-hmm.
and then warm, dry winds added to conditioning the fuels.
Yeah, no kidding.
Yeah.
And it sounded like the winds were going one way and then the other. There was kind of, according to the quotes that I was reading in the article that you wrote. So it's a real climatic problem, and so everything's ripe for this fire. So this fire started. Can you describe kind of what, if you're a person living in Lac La Biche, say you're a homesteader, you're trying to settle your own land, what were they seeing? And I imagine that seeing a fire of that magnitude was probably overwhelming and a bit apocalyptic for them, right? I imagine that being a very religious place back then, it was probably maybe thought that this was either God's work or the devil coming at them, right?
It could well be. So for the settlers around Lac La Biche, for example,
Mm-hmm.
it would have been a neat opportunity to start land clearing early
Mm-hmm.
and get the brush piles burning. And
Because of the early spring, right?
yeah, and that was the case right through east into Saskatchewan. The one quotation that I thought described it so well was a couple who had to head out to Lashburn in Saskatchewan for supplies, and they commented as they looked back to the north where their homesteads were that there was smoke coming up from the settlement area all over the place. It was just they could see smokes, but the columns were straight up, and to their minds that was a neat sign of progress in getting farming underway. But it also indicated that the winds, to start with, were quite light,
Mm-hmm.
and so it would have been a neat opportunity to burn with the columns going right up.
Mm-hmm.
And then what happened was there was a cold front. In fact, there were two cold fronts that moved through,
Mm-hmm.
and the cold fronts in fire behavior are dangerous, hazardous for five. They have five potential characteristics. One's they're preceded by gusty, turbulent winds that would fan embers.
Right.
Then the direction of the wind would change up to 90 degrees, so that fires that had spread a long way under the wind would be, they would move sideways, so to speak, on a much larger front.
Right.
It's accompanied by instability in the atmosphere, which just means that hot air would rise even more quickly than normally. So there's greater intensity. The relative humidities drop as well. So all these bad things.
Yeah, just the perfect problem.
So beware the cold front
Of course.
coming through. And there were two that came through during that main period.
Oh, really?
So the next day when they looked back, it was just a solid smoke and turmoil in there. And it was good. And yes, that's when the fires spread and the greatest damage was done.
Right. So, and there was this, I was hoping to get you to read this piece from this young girl, 10-year-old girl, Teresa, how do you say it? Desjardins. And it was her description of the fire as it was heading towards Lac La Biche, right? So that's close to the start of the fire after it had all merged into one large one. Is that right?
Teresa Desjardins' story is probably the most tragic one of the many stories out of the burn. It was a group of Cree who were camped north of Meadow Lake in that Seekip Lake. A summer camp. They were fishing and living off the land and probably hunting. And yeah, this is Teresa's quote. It's in a story that's recorded by Joe Dion in his book, My Tribe, the Cree.
Okay.
And one particular incident. And so this group of 21 Cree were camped by the edge of the lake. And as she described, and this is the quote, it was pitch dark, but there was a yellow glow which seemed to reach the sky. Balls of fire were falling all around us. The jackpine trees had become ignited and were like big torches. By the time we reached the lake, The heat was terrific. Mother had managed to grab a blanket and a horsehide robe from the tent. These Father threw in the water and covered 3 of us with a blanket. Firebrands were falling all around us. Some fell on our blanket, and we had to keep it dipped in the water constantly to prevent it from burning over us. We were all badly burned, especially my father. The horsehide, which he had thrown over my mother and little sister, had burned to a crisp on Mother's back. And then it goes on to say that Teresa's father died the next day of burns sustained while keeping the blankets wet.
Yeah, I can't even imagine that situation.
Yeah,
that's something
hard.
You see out of a movie, right? Like it's just I mean, I think in recent years, if you've lived in Alberta, you've been able to notice the pitch dark that comes in the middle of the afternoon from some of these giant fires from Alberta and from BC coming over, and it totally blacks out everything, makes it look like middle of the night. And then to see that in 1919 and to have fireballs raining around you and to have to take shelter literally in the lake is the only safe place to go. Like I don't think anyone can.
It's hard to imagine.
Yeah, just to try to relate to that in any way seems nearly impossible unless you've been through it. I mean, it's wild. It's wild. Yeah.
It is. And the of that group of 21, there were 11 died in that fire as it came over them.
So half. Oh man,
it's
half of your community gone.
Horrendous.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it's something else.
Yeah. There was another story told by another family story by Wolf River on the Alberta side.
Sure.
And the family group was camped in the same way. The father and the son had gone off checking bear traps. And the family had camped by the creek in there, the mother and the 2 kids.
Mm-hmm.
And the same fire, or the fire under those same conditions about the same time, burned in on them.
Right.
So the mother tried catching the horses, but they wouldn't be caught, so she turned them loose, and she took the 2 kids and herself into the creek, and also had a moose hide to keep them. And it was one of the daughters who recounted the story that the fire just came over them, but her mother kept with a baby as well, kept them wet and kept them out under the moose hide. So, and then came out, and of course the camp was gone. The horses had died, and
they survived.
They were stuck. Yeah. So, as she described it, the father and the son, who had gone off looking for the bear traps, were outside the fire, and they came back, and the father didn't have the courage to come back to the camp because I could see that it was burned over. So he sent the boy to have a look very cautiously. And so the boy was happy to be able to run back to his dad and say that the family was still alive. But it took them 3 days to get back to Wolf Lake through the burn. Their moccasins had gone, and they had no supplies. It was difficult.
Well, I imagine burnt as well. They probably, just because they survived doesn't mean they were unscathed. I imagine there were probably serious injuries too.
They were, yeah.
Man, people back then were gritty, weren't they? Like
they were survivors.
Oh my goodness.
Yes. Well, some didn't survive.
Yeah, no kidding. I can't imagine the social media group we got now handling that very well. Yeah. Can't tweet about it.
Yeah. So the fire, we looked. I was going to say that this whole study of the 1919 burn began when Tom McCanio, who was a lawyer in Lac-La-Biche, is a naturalist, a strong advocate for forestry and nature reserves, and So in conversation, he asked, did I know that the town of Lac-La-Biche had burned in 1919? And I didn't know that.
Yeah.
So it led to a lot of study, wondering, what were the circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
And it turned out in our studies that the fire was not the fire, it was many fires.
Right.
That were scattered over 100 miles.
Somehow many Great Fires doesn't have the same punch as the Great Fire, though.
So the Great Fire is great because there were so many fires.
Right.
And it covered so much area.
Mm-hmm. It's fascinating. So how much, maybe we'll do that after. So because the town of Lac-La-Biche burned through and a bunch of other communities and a bunch of, I'm sure, Cree nations probably were moved out of their land as well because of this fire, because it went from Alberta into Saskatchewan. So can you describe the situation in Lac-La-Biche itself? Was it the major, like the biggest community that was lost in this fire, or were there?
Yes, it was.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, Lac-La-Biche was a major center. It was a pioneering center. It was founded on the site that David Thompson had discovered back in the late 1700s,
mm-hmm.
and the Oblate Fathers established a mission at Lac-La-Biche. And Lac-La-Biche was a gathering place for indigenous peoples,
right,
to begin with the availability of fish and some arable land,
right,
around there. So it was a sizable community.
Mm-hmm.
It was accessible primarily by railway. It was on the line that became the Northern Alberta Railway,
right,
and built by J.D. MacArthur, the railway tycoon.
Right.
Yeah. So it was a place of substance, and with the mission, and there was J.D. MacArthur built a hotel there to try to attract people to take advantage of the lake and the wonderful beaches.
Yeah, no kidding. Yeah, it's a fascinating spot.
But it was also being actively homesteaded around there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a wild, like, just to imagine the size of this fire. So, like, there's disputing reports, like, and you said even in here that we're not sure exactly how big it was because we didn't have the technology really to map it out, I don't think. But online, I did my own kind of looking around, and there was anywhere from 1.3 to 2.8 million hectares was the range that I found. And do you remember what you found the range was? I can't remember in the paper there.
Yeah, in my summaries,
because you're probably the one who did the most research into this, as well as the gentleman you spoke of before. But you've been the one who's probably done the most research into this, and so probably have the most accurate data, I would assume.
Yeah. So I worked with Cordy Teamstra.
Oh, okay. On this
one too, and together we realized that this wasn't a single fire; it was a combination, of many fire events. So we went to district histories and
mm-hmm.
and fire reports and compiled the locations of as many fires that we could, and plotted where there had been reports of fires.
Mm-hmm.
And these were spread over an area, if you could think of it as a long oval running east and west.
Okay.
That it stretched about 460 kilometers.
Oh, my goodness.
So this was the area within which that fires had burned. It didn't all burn, but the long axis, east and west, was about 460 kilometers. And the long axis in a north-south direction was about 230 kilometers. So within that gargantuan area, which was probably about 4.5 million hectares, what we think burned was probably about 2 million hectares.
Just around 2
million.
million.
So actually 2 million hectares of actual burn. And so a lot of those burns ran together. Others were single burns that just burned on their own. But they all burned during that 10-day period.
That's bananas.
In March, yes.
Well, I mean, I looked up some stats on how much burns we've seen recently. So in the last, just to put it into context, right, what 2 million hectares of burned area means, right? In the last 10 years across Canada, and that's including some of the biggest fire years we've seen like on record, right? In the last 10 years across Canada, we've seen 2.5 million hectares burned. That's including last year, which was a giant portion of that.
Yeah.
So in 10 days, they burnt
Approximately 2 million hectares.
approximately the same amount that burnt in Canada in the last 10 years. So it's ridiculous to imagine the scope of this thing, right? Like
It is indeed.
I can't imagine like the smoke plume that's got to be one it was probably in Europe over, like it could have been in China, like who knows, right? Like this smoke plume would have been up, like you would have been seen from space if we were in space at that time. It would have been wild. Yeah.
So, and the area actually burned, this 5 million or 2 million hectares, is larger than the combined areas of the entire Banff and Jasper National Parks.
Oh, yeah.
Because for perspective, that was the area that actually burned.
That's nuts. It's crazy to imagine something like that back then, right? Like I think.
Yeah, and that long axis of 463 kilometers would be equivalent to driving so for almost 4 hours.
Yeah.
And through a burn that ran at full extent.
Yeah, that's why to travel that distance back then, even if you had I don't know if a vehicle could even travel along that route, but like to travel that distance back then, it would have taken you what, like a week?
Yes, I suppose, yes.
Yeah, I guess I have no idea. It would have taken a
wagon, yes.
Yeah, so it makes sense that it was how many burns do you think congregated to make this fire?
Oh, I would imagine 100 or so.
It was a lot.
Yeah.
Okay, I see. So there did it move eastward? Or was it just did it all just kind of start and just merge together?
I think the prevailing travel was easterly.
Okay, which makes sense. We have a prevailing
but there were ignitions
wind,
all through that area.
And it's fascinating. But I can't even imagine something like that back then. It must have been, like we said before, it must have been like fear of God type stuff, right? I mean, people would have been. I mean, there was a quote in there actually. Yeah, I wanted to bring up from the constable Fred Moses.
Yes,
and he thought that there was an eclipse that day.
It was common knowledge, yes, that there was an eclipse of the sun because it vanished and became just a little red ball.
Wow.
Or vanished altogether.
Right. But there wasn't an eclipse.
No, there was not.
There was no
I checked that. It was just that the fire and the smoke was so intense.
Wow. So it actually tricked them into thinking that there was an eclipse because that's... Yeah,
so that was a common remark in the news accounts was that this fact that the sky darkened and it was black. It was dark.
So this would have been places.
Roosters were crowing.
You even got the animals confused,
yes,
right?
That's right. Yes.
Wow. Yeah, what a crazy time to try and deal with that. So that was, as far as we know, that was unprecedented. Like that's the first time that I should say European settlers had encountered such a devastating event, right? Like I'm sure the indigenous people before that are probably have histories of such fires from, thousands of years back. But that was the first time in modern history with like European settlers that we'd come across something like this.
Yeah. And in Canada, that is, there had been previous fires that were very destructive, like the Great Fire in the Miramichi in New Brunswick.
Oh, okay.
And I can't recall the specs of that, but that was good. And then there was
What year was that? Do you remember? Ish? It was before this.
It was the 1800s, but I can't recall the specific year. Yeah, and then there was the Peshtigo, Wisconsin fire.
Oh, okay.
And the Chicago fire.
Some big ones.
That were big. But on the Western Canadian scene.
Okay.
And I don't think the size of the fire was appreciated at the time. Like this was time of settlement, and there were forest fires, and people accepted that there were forest fires,
right?
And they weren't all that uncommon.
Mm-hmm.
It's only looking back, putting this fire event in perspective, aggregating all the data, that illustrates how extensive it was.
Yeah, no kidding. It's it takes the technology of today and the resources that you have at your fingertips to search and find multiple resources and bring them all together to sort this out. It's interesting. Yeah, we don't even back then they probably didn't realize how big this was.
No, I don't think so.
It's fascinating.
And because it was so large and covered so much area, the effects, the impact of the fire was different. For example, the town of Lac-La-Biche did burn down. There were a few homes that were saved, but and the hotel and the church were saved.
Mm-hmm.
The railway station was saved because they had the foresight to move with the locomotive between the fire and the station, and they were able to hold it. Yes,
a little fire break.
And the church was reported saved through a miracle of the change in.
Oh, I'm sure that was
wind.
Chalked up to God protecting his
was,
own. Yeah.
Indeed.
I'm sure it was.
What I found was so impressive was that the fire impacted so many areas and had its diverse effects. For example, just south of Lac-La-Biche was logging camp number 4 of J.D. MacArthur's.
Okay.
Operational. J.D. MacArthur had a huge set of steam-powered sawmills in Edmonton, North Edmonton. That's actually on the site where Nelson Lumber is right now
awesome.
On the road, yes, Highway 2 North. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so he was a railroad builder, and he cut logs and hauled them in by rail to his mill in Edmonton. So he had a camp set up, it was Camp 4, just south of the town of Lac-La-Biche, and the fire hit his operation. MacArthur's logging crews comprised about 1,000 men.
Oh wow, that's a big
operation. It was estimated, yeah. So so to cut logs then was with the crosscut saw and axe.
Yeah,
it was a slow process, so a lot of manpower was
intensive. You don't kidding.
Was needed, yeah. So he.
So that dudes cutting that wood.
Yeah. So there was an employment opportunity for 1,000 men that was lost as a consequence of the fire. But he lost 14 cars loaded with logs, and he lost 42 ballast cars.
Wow.
As well. So he had to shut down the operation.
Permanently?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
So MacArthur, that was a spur line south of Lac-La-Biche, and it was heading east. And his plan was he could build that right to the Saskatchewan border, cutting logs along the way.
I see. So
but after the fire that ended that dream, and MacArthur then shifted most of his logging to the north in the Lesser Slave area.
Okay. So where did his rail line end when the fire happened? Like how far had he gotten into Saskatchewan before?
I think it was only about 5 or 6 miles
into Saskatchewan when he had to quit.
Towards Saskatchewan.
Oh, towards.
He didn't ever come close to the Saskatchewan border at that point. So this was a spur line from south of Lac-La-Biche that was heading easterly.
Gotcha. So Lac-La-Biche, he made it 5 or 6 miles, and then the fire happened and stopped them.
Gotcha. Yes. So it's probably the same fire that hit them both.
So did they lose any? Did he lose any employees? Any of those?
No, none of the men was lost.
Oh, okay. But they were actively logging at the time of the fire.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, thank God they didn't. So how many people were lost in this fire? How many communities? How many people? Just I want to paint a picture of the devastation of this, because obviously there was a lot of forest resources lost and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But how many communities and people were impacted by this?
Yes. So. The fatalities, the major fatalities seem to have been among the indigenous people. There were 2 indigenous young men on Wolf Mountain at the time of the fire. That's just a little east of Lac-La-Biche.
Okay.
Yeah, and they were on a spring bear hunt. And the fire caught them, and their relatives found the remains and later brought them out.
Ugh.
So that was a tough one.
Yeah.
And then there was the families that I described and the ones
in the lake there. Yeah.
In the lake. Yeah, and I don't know how many others were influenced.
I'm sure there was.
But it's amazing how few fatalities there were in the fire of that extent. So besides the settlement areas, and in the settlement, people took escape in sloughs and in the fields and
right
wherever moisture was available.
Mm-hmm.
There was a tremendous sawmilling industry in Saskatchewan. There were there was a sawmill at Big River that employed about 1,000 men, and there was a Prince Albert Lumber Company at Prince Albert. So there are lots of stories about how, for the Big River sawmill, which was in the forest, how the crews there evacuated the town by railway. Those that couldn't get out were saved, were put on a barge.
Oh.
And
on
the lake at Big River.
So they were moving the logs from one side of the lake to the other on a barge.
Yeah.
And they just...
So they put people on the barge, but most of the people who had been taken out by train, they could see the fire approaching.
Man, that's crazy.
Yeah. So again, there were about 1,000 employees of that mill. The Prince Albert mill was east of Prince Albert on the Saskatchewan River, so it was never threatened by the fire, but they lost their timber.
Oh yeah.
As well. In fact, as it was, both sawmills were closed down. They operated for a year or two on salvage, but the timber. One comment was that the forest had just vanished. It disappeared.
Wow. Yeah, I guess. Hey, like if that's because we're back then, you're talking about you're cutting in proximity. You're not hauling logs from hundreds of kilometers away like we do now. You're doing it right next to the sawmill type thing, or a few miles is probably as far as you go, or maybe across if you have something like a waterway that helps. But so that proximity, once it's gone, it's gone. So it had a huge impact economically then as well.
It did. Yes, those two mills closed. Mm-hmm. Yeah, one went to further east to the Paw. The other one closed down and set up mills at Lumberton in British Columbia and in the Prince
George. Lumberton?
Lumberton.
What a name. There you go. Good for them. Lumberton. Yes. What do they do there? I don't know.
Yeah. And the others were north of Prince George.
Okay. Gotcha.
Yeah. No, the Lumberton mill is another story. It was a kind of huge, big steam-powered sawmill, and they were logging up this river valley. Yeah. And so it was a river driving operation, and they had a set of flumes. And no, this is a digression on Lumberton. But I had an opportunity. I was timber cruising there in 1952. As part of the Forest Survey crew in British Columbia. Mm-hmm. And we stayed at a logging camp for part of our study, and I got talking with the bow cook, and he was quite eager to tell his story because he was from Czechoslovakia, and he'd come to work as a logger at Lumberton. And so he said he would take me out and show me around one Sunday, and he did. It was just a marvelous experience. The mill had long closed, but they were, I can't recall the name of the river, but they were logging up the valley. Oh, yeah. And so they were river driving the logs down to this huge steam-powered mill located on the railway. And they were bringing their logs down on a flume.
Describe a flume for me. I'm not even familiar with that.
Yeah, so a flume is is kind of a trough. If you could think of a watering trough or a feeding trough with a bottom and sides, mm-hmm. and built of lumber. Okay. And so the idea was it would dam up the river to divert the flow of water into this flume.
Uh-huh.
And it turned out they had 30 miles.
Oh, my God. So
At the end of the operation, they were 30 miles up the valley. And
so you're talking about a tree slide. This is like you're sending logs down a slide down the valley. Basically.
Yeah, but
it's a water slide for trees.
It's water slide.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So to come, they had they described they had 2 tunnels to get through a ridge, and they had 3 high trestles to carry the water over some of the side valleys.
Oh my God.
Yeah, and he described how on Saturday they worked a 6-day week. Mm-hmm. Saturday night was the night to blow out and rest up on Sunday. He said when they went out on the Saturday to log, they took their best shoes and a change of clothes in a little sack and stashed them where they were logging. And then when they were done, they'd picked out good-sized logs. They would roll them into the flume and jump on them with their cork boots and get a free ride down to the sawmill where they could go have their Saturday night blowout.
Man, OH&S would have a field day with that one.
That's right.
I kind of,
that was
there's got to be a few
time
fatalities
altogether.
with that. Like, I can't imagine that's the safest way to go, but it would be a good time. Man, just cowboys back then. Hey, like, what the hell?
Whatever works, yes.
Man, that's amazing. Yeah, I can't imagine living in that time. It's just such it's wild. That's so cool.
Yes.
Oh, man.
Yeah, so I think it was a time of just doing things.
Yeah. Did you ever give the flume a ride?
No, it was closed down by that
point?
time.
Damn it.
Yeah, but I was certainly envious of them. I thought it would be so neat.
Yeah, yeah, no kidding, right?
With cork boots, you can get a good grip on the log and away you go.
Man, that's awesome. Now I want to know how fast they were going.
I didn't ask.
We talking highway speeds? Or I imagine not, but still, a good time. Man, that's something else.
Yeah, so kind of a side story to the
a bit of a diversion.
Fire of 1919, but the implication was that the sawmill moved there and set up that operation.
So a lot of change. So how did this fire, or never did say how many, do you know roughly how many people or how many fatalities there were roughly, or how many communities were impacted roughly, or just as a general, just for people to have a number? Not really sure.
Yeah, no.
Was it in the
there weren't that many.
Okay, it was like the dozens of people, or?
Well, there were the 11 at Seacup.
The 11, the 2 brothers,
and the 2 brothers on Wolf Mountain.
There was no reports.
And those are the only 2.
Oh, okay. So there's no one in Laklavish died and other communities that we know of.
Not that I know of.
Okay, but there very easily could have been many other fatalities that were further in the.
But there were injuries.
Sure.
Yeah, and the Saskatchewan government set up a field hospital at Meadow Lake, or near Meadow Lake, to look after the many, largely probably Indigenous people who had suffered severe burns.
Oh, I imagine.
And needed medical help. So that ran right through till the fall, I think.
Do you know
that field hospital?
Do you know how much of the Indigenous communities stuck around? And was it you said when you were describing the burn, you're saying it covered a 4 million hectare area, but only about 2 million of that burned because it must have been a pretty patchy burn. It wasn't a solid wall of fire that went through. It was just kind of patchy and probably burning out all the conifer and leaving a lot of the deciduous stands and stuff. But so did a lot of the Indigenous communities stick around after that, or did they have to pick up and move elsewhere? Do you know?
That I don't know. I think the country was large enough that they would just shift areas.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Cool. So it's, what, did we see a lot of changes after this fire happened? Do we see any changes to fire management, how we were monitoring forest fires and that kind of stuff? Like when did the fire towers start coming in? If you don't know, that's okay. Yeah.
No, I can't give you a precise answer, but as I mentioned, the forests were managed by the Dominion government. So there was a Dominion Forestry Branch. It was formed in 1899, and it gradually extended to Saskatchewan and Alberta. About the so I think about 1905 was when the forest services began to emerge.
Okay.
So it was Dominion forestry. The Dominion government wasn't well financed at that time,
Right.
either. It was
It's only 14 years old, really, for the forestry branch part of it, anyways. Yeah.
Yeah. And they had a lot of area to cover. They were looking after forests in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, and also in the railway belt in British Columbia, which was a 40-mile wide strip following the CPR. So the resources were spread pretty thinly. So what they decided to do was concentrate their efforts on setting up forest reserves. They identified forest reserves on what they felt were the most productive, most valuable forest stands, which in their estimation were particularly on the prairies, looking after the watershed areas. So in Alberta, they focused their attention on the east slopes of the Rockies. Banff and Jasper were set up about that time, and the forest reserve, Rocky Mountains Forest Reserve, ran from the U.S. border north, following along the east side of Banff and Jasper.
Oh.
So, so this is part of the Dominion forestry project. And then there was a forest reserve set up at Slave Lake.
Okay.
Protect the watershed areas of the Swan Hills and Martin Hills, just to the northeast. So that's where most of their efforts were focused. And I don't recall when the first lookout was built, but it was probably around 1905 or 6.
Oh, so
in southern Alberta. But it was a slow progression, and they were focused on those forest reserve areas. For the rest of the forest areas, they hired fire rangers, which are usually employed starting in roughly May, when the forest began to dry out during that spring burning period, and they would be employed until the first snowfall in the fall.
Right. After this fire came through, they went from using fire rangers in these large, vast areas in the northern provinces to using they'd actually begun to use aircraft for monitoring.
Yes.
So would that be so? They were just monitoring fire conditions, and then once they reached a certain level of risk, they would throw airplanes in the air and keep tabs on everything. That's pretty cool.
Yeah. And they were using. They were working at that time with the National Air Board.
Okay.
National Air Board was a offshoot of the Great War, when airplanes were used as part of the warfare activities and mapping.
All those vet pilots got to have something to do after
war, right? That's right, yes. And they used the World War I vintage aircraft.
Oh, yeah.
So in Saskatchewan, they used the float planes.
Oh, okay. That makes sense.
Yeah, the Vickers series. Yeah. And they were used mostly for patrol.
Right.
And they figured, too, by patrolling, they would show a presence and perhaps remind people to be careful with fires. So there was not much opportunity for using them to transport men and equipment. But it was more of a fire prevention awareness program. Yeah, and in Saskatchewan, there was forest. I was going to say about when they were setting up forest reserves. There had been proposals for a forest reserve at Lac La Biche as well. It was never completed, but there was a proposal to do it. But in Saskatchewan, the Sturgeon River was covered by a forest reserve. And there were forest reserves kind of to the east and along the escarpment between Saskatchewan and Manitoba.
Oh, okay.
So if you look on a map, you can see that they're really on raised hills where there were forests at the edge of the prairie.
Gotcha. Yeah.
So the Sturgeon Forest Reserve was the big one northwest of Prince Albert. Right. And after the fire had consumed most of the timber, especially in the southern half, the Dominion government turned it into a national park.
Oh, okay.
So it's one of the early national parks. So the Prince Albert National Park is the old Sturgeon Forest Reserve.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
So
Gotcha.
and
And
that
it happened to turn into a park because of the fire afterwards. 'Cause
Yes.
there was
no more timber.
to be harvested. Yeah, that makes sense. Huh. So what else did we change? I was thinking about, this is around the time where we started doing wildfire fighting, right? And not just prevention, but fighting and that kind of stuff. Do you think that this fire was the catalyst that started us on our war against wildfire, and kind of maybe it scared us a little bit too much, and we've kind of maybe we overcorrected a bit? What do you think? That's kind of, I don't know. I didn't do the research, but it seems like it might have been one of those things, because this was a huge fire that was in the news around the country, and maybe even, I don't know, across the globe, because I'm guessing the smoke made it all the way, but it was well known, right? So I wonder if this was the catalyst that started us down that path of,
No, I think the catalyst had already been established.
Oh, okay.
From a historic standpoint, in the West, which was formerly Rupert's Land of the Hudson's Bay Company. So, and Canada acquired that in 1870 after Confederation, buying the lands from the Hudson's Bay Company.
Isn't that nuts that most of Canada was owned by a company at one point?
That central part it was, yes, indeed.
Yeah, it's a capitalist's dream, right?
Yeah, so it was a good purchase.
Yeah, no kidding.
So the federal government set up a Department of the Interior. That was around 1870 to look after this huge Rupert's Land area. And there were farsighted people who recognized that the water flowing through the prairies was an essential resource, and that the water supply the rivers originated in the mountains.
Right.
And so they passed an act that enabled the government to set up forest reserves to protect the crests and slopes of the mountains for watershed value.
Yeah, it's incredible. Like we said,
so that was in 1885, I think, and it was that same year that the initial legislation that led to Banff National Park was established. So that was the catalyst that got the national parks established, Banff, Jasper, Waterton, and the forest reserves to the east, and it also was the impetus behind the forest reserves, such as the Sturgeon Forest Reserve, on the other heights of land around the edge of the prairies.
Gotcha. So that's what you think was also the catalyst for our regime of fire.
Yeah, I think that was it, more than the fire. I don't think anybody really appreciated how large this 1919 fire
so it wasn't big news as we think it was. Okay.
Yeah, it was news at the time it was burning, and then.
Okay.
Yes, and the government, to its credit, or giving them due recognition, had lots of demands and not much income source. They weren't into deficit financing at that point.
Right.
So it was a while before the economy got strong enough to support forest protection organizations.
Of course.
Yeah, and they were focused on the forest reserves in Alberta.
No, it makes sense. Yeah, it's a fascinating time. Just that I can't imagine a fire of this magnitude right nowadays. Like it'd be all over the world. We know about it, right? And back then, it just kind of swept under the rug.
Just another fire.
Yeah, there's a fire up north. Oh, crazy! That's it. That's cool. Yeah, that's wild. Yeah, it's interesting that it takes someone like yourself to find an interest, to hear from some fella you met in Lac La Biche in the 80s, and then to dive into it, and you're the real resource, you and your partners in writing this and researching this, to understanding that this fire even happened, right? And it's interesting, like with my job doing forest inventories, I see in that area that it's a lot of kind of 1920, a lot of 100-year-old trees, right? And we come across that a lot of times. Like I find doing inventory in the province, it's a lot of 1940 origin, 1920 origin, and there must have been a bunch of fires going on right around that time, and it's cool to find one like this and to find evidence of it, and to find, you know what I mean, to know exactly, or not exactly, but approximately the impact that it had. It's pretty, it's neat. It's really cool.
It is.
Yeah. It takes someone like yourself to actually suss out all this information, and you know what I mean. You'd think it's something that the government would have an understanding of, but if the government was only just formed then, so it was just sorting itself out. Yeah, but it takes that looking back in time to catch up on that and learn from it, right? Yeah,
it does. Yeah, and it's easier to look back in hindsight and see how things are than to figure it out at the time when everything's in turmoil.
Yeah, no kidding. Yeah, especially considering the economic and situation and all that other stuff, right? And the political situation, and people's minds were elsewhere.
Yeah, but it's a reminder too that there is a propensity for large fires, and we see that. We've seen it just this year in the Chuckhead fire, that there was a continuity of fuel and the weather conditions, weather conditions. You know, that fire started during the spring drought period under strong winds, and once it gets away, it's gone.
It's gone. Yeah, it is a fascinating point, right? Like I would love to know if there were fires of large magnitude like this pre-settlement, you know, because it's just a point of, because even this fire was human caused, right? And it's, although the situation was there, right? The same situation that we have today, 100 years later, is a lot of continuity of forest, dry climate, and we have big fires now. But it's interesting to see that back then the same thing was going on. It's a good point for sure. It just goes to show that these fires have always been around, right? But
they haven't. We don't know really what the causes were at that time. Probably people, though. The Hudson Bay Company reported a fire, and I'm really guessing at the date here. I think it's around 1812.
Oh, okay.
The Fort Edmonton Post-Journal, but they reported a fire that had burned between Edmonton and Calgary.
Oh, really? So a lot of grassland and stuff.
Yeah, grassland, parkland, and forest. But the problem for the Hudson Bay was that the fire that spring had caused the buffalo to move away.
Yeah.
Which meant that the indigenous people moved away as well to be with the buffalo.
Right.
So there was no one to trade with, and there was no meat to be supplied to the post. So they disparagingly said they had to send crews out to Lac St. Anne to catch whitefish.
Oh, wow.
Which was a poor substitute for
for bison.
Bison, yes.
Yeah, no kidding, eh?
Which they had.
Oh, that's cool. I love looking back like this and seeing the evidence of some of these large fires and the impact of, you know, human settlement and even before that, right? Like, it's really, really cool. I love seeing it. This is awesome. This is really interesting. Do you have any words of wisdom, any final thoughts regarding, you know, regarding anything that you thought that people should know, you know?
Yeah, well, I think the current crew of experts on fire specialists know pretty well. Well, they were much more knowledgeable.
They got it figured out, I think. Yeah. Thousands of researchers and everything's, they got a lot of information.
But the point is that we're still living in a flammable environment. Mm-hmm. And if we're going to stop fires, we have to prevent them, and we have to be able to get them while they're small. Yeah,
for sure. No, absolutely. And like you said before, right? Fire is part of the landscape. It's always going to be there. So
it is.
We're going to learn to live with it, as well as, you know, protecting ourselves and our resources.
Yes, I hope we can learn to live with it, and I hope we can learn to use it appropriately at times and places of our own choosing to further our ability to manage the fires.
Use it as a tool as well. Yeah. Don't have to be so afraid of it if we know what we're doing, right? Which I think they do. Awesome.
We have some good people out there.
There is. Well, this is awesome, Peter. I appreciate you coming on and telling your story regarding this fire. And I think yeah, I think people will learn a lot. I don't think a lot of people knew about this. I didn't know about it up until you and I spoke about it, right? And you sent me the article. And where can people find this article if they want to find it?
It was published in the Journal of Forest History.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And that was in 2015.
Okay. Yeah, I think if you just Google, the Great Fire 1919, I think it pops up. I think it's one of the top 3 or 4 that pop right up.
Oh,
so
yeah. Oh, that's good.
Yeah. So there you go. If you want to read it, we got the full story there of what you wrote, and it's a really cool story to be told for sure. This is awesome, man. Thanks a lot.
You're welcome.
Awesome. Thanks a lot for listening, guys. Hope you guys like it. Remember to rate and review and tell your friends and get it out there. And I look forward to seeing you guys next time. So thanks a lot for listening. Take it easy, guys.